The exchange driven by Becca Balint unfolds as a methodical breakdown of accountability rather than a chaotic confrontation, and the key to understanding it lies in the contrast between what is asked and what is avoided. From the very beginning, when she states, "I'm not asking trick questions," she is doing more than clarifying intent, she is removing the primary excuse for evasion. In a setting built on sworn testimony, labeling a question as a trick is often a way to sidestep it, and by preemptively rejecting that framing, she forces the focus back onto substance. Yet when Pam Bondi responds not with a yes or no but with "I'm stunned," the shift becomes immediate. Stunned is not an answer, it is a reaction, and reactions function as substitutes when direct engagement with facts becomes uncomfortable or risky. From that point forward, the hearing transitions from procedural questioning into something more diagnostic, where the structure of responses becomes as important as the content itself. A name is introduced, Howard Lutnick, along with his position and documented associations connected to Jeffrey Epstein. This is not presented as speculation but as material drawn from unredacted records, which elevates the seriousness of the inquiry. The question that follows is intentionally simple. Did the Department of Justice directly ask Lutnick about those ties? It is a closed question, one that should logically produce a clear answer. Instead, Bondi redirects, stating that Lutnick has addressed those ties himself. On the surface, that sounds responsive, but structurally it is empty. Self-reporting is not equivalent to investigation. Allowing a subject to define their own explanation bypasses the very function of oversight. Balint does not let the question dissolve. She repeats it, each time narrowing the scope further, not asking about public statements or denials, but about direct action taken by the Department of Justice. And with each repetition, the absence of an answer becomes more pronounced. This is where silence stops being neutral. In an investigative context, silence accumulates meaning. Each non-answer becomes a data point, and multiple data points begin to form a pattern. When additional names are introduced, individuals holding positions like Secretary of the Navy or Deputy Secretary of Defense, the issue expands from a single case to a systemic concern. These are not peripheral figures. They are central actors within federal power structures. The inability to confirm whether any of them were questioned transforms the issue from individual oversight to institutional behavior. The moral weight of the exchange intensifies when Balint introduces a stark contrast. The Department of Justice's own statistic that a child is sexually abused every 9 minutes. This is not rhetorical embellishment, it is a statement of urgency, a reminder of why such systems exist in the first place. Against that backdrop, hesitation in addressing documented connections to a figure like Epstein becomes more than procedural delay, it becomes a contradiction. On one side, there is a declared commitment to justice and protection. On the other, there is visible reluctance to engage with specific, documented cases involving powerful individuals. The gap between those two positions is not theoretical, it is embodied in the repeated absence of answers. At a certain point, Bondi's strategy shifts. Instead of continuing to deflect, she challenges the legitimacy of the questioning itself, calling it pathetic. This marks a critical turning point because it reframes the exchange. The focus is no longer solely on the evidence or the question, but on whether the question should even be asked. This inversion is significant. It attempts to move scrutiny away from those being questioned and onto the questioner. But Balint resists that shift by repeating her original framing. These are not trick questions. That repetition is not redundancy. It is control. It anchors the discussion, preventing it from drifting too far from its original purpose. As the exchange continues, another layer is introduced. Whether the president was aware of Lutnick's ties at the time of appointment. Again, the question is direct, tied to a specific decision within a clear timeline. And again, there is no answer. Instead, procedural interruptions and attempts to reclaim time emerge. But even those procedural moves carry meaning. In a setting like this, time is not just a logistical constraint, it is a tool of accountability. Every moment spent avoiding an answer reinforces the pattern that has already formed. What follows is a familiar escalation, the introduction of unrelated figures and controversies, names like Bill Clinton and Joe Biden, not because they directly address the question, but because they expand the frame and dilute focus. This is a strategic broadening designed to diffuse pressure. However, it does not alter the underlying facts: Epstein's conviction, Lutnick's documented visits, and the absence of confirmed scrutiny prior to his appointment. These elements remain fixed, regardless of how far the conversation drifts. Ultimately, the hearing reveals something deeper than any single answer could provide. It exposes a structural pattern: direct questions met with reactions instead of answers, accountability replaced by deflection, and clarity displaced by controlled ambiguity. When stripped of tone, politics, and personality, the record becomes straightforward: a series of specific, evidence-based questions asked repeatedly, and a consistent inability or unwillingness to answer them. That pattern, more than any individual statement, defines the significance of the moment. In this exchange, the structure of questioning becomes more important than any single answer, as the focus shifts from what is said to what is consistently avoided. Senator Blumenthal narrows his inquiry with precision, asking essentially one question from multiple angles, each time removing space for ambiguity. He anchors the discussion in a clear timeline: a public post by Donald Trump calling for action, the proximity of a private dinner before the indictment of James Comey, and the official authority of Pam Bondi as Attorney General overseeing the process. At each stage, the expectation is simple: a direct confirmation or denial, but instead of resolving the issue, Bondi repeatedly refuses to engage, preserving ambiguity rather than eliminating it. This refusal is not passive; it functions as a deliberate strategy, maintaining uncertainty in a context where clarity is critical. As the questioning intensifies, the pattern becomes unmistakable: introduce evidence, ask directly, receive deflection, and repeat. Bondi shifts from non-answers to topic substitution, bringing up figures like Hunter Biden or unrelated political issues, then escalates further by challenging Blumenthal personally, attempting to undermine the credibility of the question rather than address its substance. Each of these moves displaces the original inquiry, but none resolve it, and the longer the exchange continues, the more visible the gap becomes between the precision of the questions and the evasiveness of the responses. This same pattern carries into later questioning involving figures allegedly connected to Jeffrey Epstein's network, where the issue becomes not just individual accountability but systemic behavior. When asked whether the Department of Justice investigated specific high-ranking officials, including Howard Lutnick, the expectation again is a binary answer. Instead, Bondi references public statements made by those individuals, effectively substituting self-reporting for institutional investigation. This shift is critical because it reframes responsibility, moving it away from the Department of Justice and back onto the subjects themselves. As questioning continues, silence accumulates, and in this context, silence is not neutral; it becomes data, forming a pattern of non-engagement. The introduction of unredacted records raises the stakes further, placing verified material into the public domain and demanding confirmation, yet the response remains evasive. Attempts to redirect the discussion toward tone, decorum, or unrelated political figures only reinforce the central issue. The original questions remain unanswered. Over time, the exchange evolves from a search for specific facts into a broader demonstration of how institutions respond under pressure, through deflection, substitution, escalation, and delay. What ultimately emerges is not a lack of information but a documented absence of direct answers to direct questions, and that absence becomes the defining feature of the hearing, shaping its meaning far beyond any individual statement made within it. As the exchange reaches this stage, the focus shifts from isolated moments to a fully formed pattern, where persistence itself becomes evidence. The accumulation of unanswered questions, reinforced timelines, and documented associations begins to outweigh every attempt at deflection, creating a point of convergence where absence is no longer neutral; it becomes the central fact. What emerges is not an explicitly stated conclusion but one constructed through repetition and omission, where the lack of confirmation carries as much weight as any direct statement. At this point, the hearing transitions into a new phase, no longer centered on what happened inside the room, but on what the system surrounding it has failed to do. The phrase two-tiered system stops functioning as rhetoric and starts appearing as observable behavior, reflected in how different individuals are treated under similar circumstances. The repetition of names, Howard Lutnick, John Phelan, and Stephen Feinberg, paired with the inability to confirm even basic investigative steps under the authority of Pam Bondi, transforms what might have been seen as isolated gaps into a consistent structural pattern. In any standard investigative framework, documented associations trigger inquiry, inquiry leads to interviews, and interviews produce records. Here, that chain appears to break at the very first step, leaving a silence that signals not delay but stoppage. This breakdown becomes more significant when placed against the moral and operational expectations of the justice system itself. If a network like that of Jeffrey Epstein is defined as a large-scale, multi-decade criminal enterprise, then every verified connection should intensify scrutiny, not reduce it. Yet the record suggests the opposite, that proximity to power may correspond with a reduction in visible enforcement. The timeline, spanning Epstein's 2008 conviction, subsequent associations, and later appointments to high office, remains fixed, and that stability creates pressure because it cannot be explained away through narrative shifts or expanded discussion. Attempts to introduce unrelated figures or controversies do not alter the underlying sequence. They only highlight the distance from the original question. As the hearing progresses, it evolves into something more than oversight. It becomes a demonstration of institutional behavior under pressure. The repeated inability to confirm whether fundamental investigative actions were taken turns the hearing itself into evidence, revealing how decisions are made not just in policy, but in practice. At its core, this moment raises a question about consistency. Whether the same standards are applied universally or adjusted depending on who is involved. The absence of clear answers, especially at the highest levels of authority, creates a visible gap between stated principles: justice, accountability, transparency, and observable actions. That gap is where trust begins to erode, not suddenly but incrementally, through each unanswered question and each unresolved contradiction. When the system emphasizes its commitment to justice while failing to demonstrate it in specific, testable ways, the result is not ambiguity but dissonance. And that dissonance extends beyond this single exchange, shaping how future cases, decisions, and institutions are perceived. Ultimately, the hearing stops being about extracting new information and becomes about documenting what is missing. The pattern of refusal, deflection, and substitution forms a record that does not rely on interpretation. It simply requires attention. And once that record exists, the question is no longer whether the issue has been exposed, but whether exposure will lead to correction or merely stand as evidence of a system willing to tolerate its own inconsistencies. At this stage, the argument reaches its most grounded and consequential form, where the distinction between theory and observation disappears. The expectation in any standard system is straightforward. When an individual appears in documented investigative material tied to a known criminal network, that individual is questioned, interviewed, and placed within a formal process designed to establish facts. But here, that process appears to halt before it even begins, and that is where the idea of a two-tiered system shifts from a claim into something observable. The difference is not rooted in the strength of the evidence but in how that evidence is handled, and response, more than policy, defines enforcement. When the response is inconsistent, enforcement becomes selective, and once enforcement becomes selective, the foundation of equal justice begins to weaken. The moral dimension intensifies this reality because the stakes extend far beyond procedure or politics. The statistic that a child is sexually abused every 9 minutes in the United States is not just a number. It represents a continuous demand for action, for vigilance, and for accountability. In that context, every unanswered question is not simply a gap in testimony. It represents a missed opportunity for the system to act as intended. Each deflection or delay contributes to a broader perception that the system does not respond uniformly, and that inconsistency carries real consequences. For survivors, this is not about rhetoric or tone. It is about whether their experiences are met with the same level of seriousness regardless of who is implicated. What they witness in moments like this is not just a failure to answer questions, but a failure to demonstrate that the system will pursue truth without exception. Pam Bondi, in that moment, had a clear opportunity to establish clarity, either by confirming that inquiries had been made or by explaining why they had not. Either path would have created a definable position. Instead, the absence of both confirmation and denial leaves only ambiguity, and ambiguity, especially at this level, functions as a substitute for accountability. It allows movement without commitment and preserves flexibility at the cost of transparency. Over time, choices like this do not remain isolated. They form patterns, and patterns become precedent. If silence becomes the default response in high-visibility cases, it raises serious questions about how less visible cases are handled, those that never reach public hearings, where scrutiny is lower and accountability is easier to avoid. Ultimately, this brings the issue to its most fundamental layer: trust. Not political alignment or institutional loyalty, but basic confidence that the system operates as it claims to. A system maintains its legitimacy not through statements of principle, but through consistent application of those principles. When evidence is presented, it must be examined. When questions are asked, they must be answered. Without that consistency, the system does not fail dramatically. It erodes gradually, as each unanswered question adds to a growing sense of imbalance. What remains at the end of this exchange is not a record of resolved facts, but a record of avoided ones, not a sequence of actions taken, but of actions deferred. And that distinction matters, because it shifts the focus away from individuals and toward the structure itself, whether it applies its rules equally or adjusts them when enforcement becomes difficult. That is the question that now extends beyond this hearing, shaping how every future case will be understood and judged.